let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
The attempt to assure liberty in South Vietnam leads to war. The turning point is the assassination of an ally.
I regret the necessities of war have compelled us to bomb North Vietnam. We have carefully limited those raids. They've been directed at concrete and steel, and not human life.
President Johnson inherits the Vietnam burden and commits America to combat. These early days are the most critical days of decision.
Here now is the Chief Executive.
There's a long history of our effort to prevent Vietnam from falling under the control of the communists. That is what we are now attempting to do, and as the war has increased in scope, our assistance has increased as a result of the requests of the government.
June 1963, President John F. Kennedy's support of the Saigon government is shaken by internal opposition led by the Buddhists. In Saigon, an elderly monk burns himself to death in protest against religious discrimination. The highly publicized suicide further dismays President Kennedy, who is about to appoint a new ambassador, Henry Cabot Lodge.
That horrified President Kennedy. I remember going into the Oval Room, and there was the picture of this old man sitting cross-legged, burning himself alive. And President Kennedy said, look at that. Look at what things have come to.
The U.S. calms the crisis, but Buddhist leaders complain of continued persecution and take their cause to the streets. In summer-long riots, a dozen Buddhists are killed, hundreds injured. In late June, President Kennedy formally appoints Henry Cabot Lodge as ambassador to Saigon and tells him,
I have confidence in you, and I want you to go out there and see if we can't get the government to behave better.
Does that mean you'll be arriving on the scene with sympathy for the Buddhist cause?
It means I'll be arriving on the scene as an American who believes in religious tolerance.
Before Lodge arrives, 5 monks commit suicide. As Buddhist demonstrations spread, other factions support them, and the government responds with greater force. In August, special police raid Buddhist pagodas and arrest senior monks. Washington publicly condemns the pagoda raids, but is divided on policy. Former CIA Director William Colby.
That period of 1963 was one of the most agonizing and intense periods of debate that I've ever experienced inside our government. There was a very intense division of opinion in the government.
The division is over South Vietnam's president, Ngo Dinh Diem, whether he's a viable ally after 8 years of autocratic family rule. Washington decides Diem may regain popularity if his brother and chief advisor, Nhu, is removed. Washington cables Ambassador Lodge. He is told to inform key Vietnamese generals of American concern. But the cable is interpreted as a green light for a coup d'etat. An author of the cable, Assistant Secretary of State Roger Hilsman.
The overall gist of that cable was to say that we would prefer a government continuing with Diem, but if they felt, the generals, that they had no choice, then we would examine the government that they established on its own merits. Now, of course, there is no question that this, with all of its hedges, does encourage them.
We frightened an awful lot of generals by asking them because they were terrified that this would get back to the government and lead to their arrest and incarceration, if at least. They said no at that time, but they said, if we get interested, we'll give you a call sometime.
The generals are not yet ready to act, but the climate for a coup develops in late August. 5 days after his arrival, Ambassador Lodge sends Washington an optimistic appraisal of a revolt by the generals. The political pressure mounts in early September. 800 high school students are arrested for joining Buddhist protests. Kennedy is concerned over Diem's actions, but the possible loss of South Vietnam alarms him.
We don't want to have a repetition of China, because that was the most damaging event, certainly, that's occurred to us, and perhaps in this century, when that passed into the control of the communists. What has concerned us is the events of the past 2 months do not give us as great an assurance for success in the struggle as was true up till May and June. Now we are attempting to use our influence to bring the situation back to what it was.
Kennedy and his advisors first consider how to pressure for reforms. They advise Ambassador Lodge to discourage coup plans, but to cultivate coup leaders. This brings in the CIA and the involvement throughout of Agent Lucien Conin.
It was quite obvious that if at any one point that this American hand had shown that the whole thing would blow up, and therefore it would be an extreme embarrassment. Therefore, Ambassador Lodge made it very clear to me that if something went wrong, that he would have to be able to have deniability that I even existed. You know, you could liken it to a football team. Ambassador Lodge was a quarterback. The coaching was being conducted by Washington, D.C., and I was the eyes and ears and the mouthpiece of Henry Cabot Lodge to the junta.
By October, the generals are ready with a coup plan. Its initiators include the Deputy Chief of Staff and Diem's personal military advisor, General Min. Min directs overall coup activities. He presents CIA agent Conin with proposals to overthrow the government, including assassination. Conin passes the information to Ambassador Lodge.
I was told that I was not to encourage, nor was I to discourage a coup by my ambassador. Those were the exact words that I was told.
Washington goes further. President Kennedy, Secretary of State Rusk, and Defense Secretary McNamara evaluate policy. They consider the coup proposals of General Min, then cable secret approval to Ambassador Lodge. The generals get the green light.
My instructions were that I was to inform General Min that the United States government would not thwart their coup. And I conveyed this.
Now, this was a Vietnamese general's coup, yes, but I think the fundamentals of it were decided in our White House, because a few weeks before, the president in a press conference had said that it was essential to contemplate new people in the Vietnamese government, and that could only be interpreted as the president and his brother in any real terms. Now, these were green lights to the generals to go ahead, reinforced by a question raised by one of them that if the Diem regime were replaced, would the United States continue to support a successor regime, obviously led by the government's? Answer from the White House, yes. Now, if you ask for a green light for a coup, I think that's it.
By late October, Chief of Staff General Tran Van Don joins the plot. He becomes the go-between with the U.S. Embassy. General Don meets with Agent Conin, who wants definite information. But the generals are reluctant to reveal details of their plans to the CIA. Konin keeps pressuring.
On the 25th of October, once again, Lieutenant Konin came to ask me when we plan to make the coup. How to answer him, I don't know. And that is a very delicate question. And I asked him again, are you authorized from the American side to talk with me and discuss with me about the coup? He said, yes, by Cabot Lodge. I said, Cabot Lodge didn't tell me anything.
2 days later, President Diem reviews the National Day Parade. There are no outward signs of change. Diem still rejects political reforms. Ambassador Lodge is now convinced that Diem will not change. The generals want the ambassador's personal assurance of U.S. support for a coup. Lodge seeks a date, but go-between General Dunn remains secretive.
Mr. Ambassador, you have enough means already. What we need is your support, the support of the United States if we will success for something which could change the regime. And I asked him, please, don't interfere in this case, because that is a Vietnamese affair between the Vietnamese themselves. He said, all right.
They wanted it to take its course. They wanted the Vietnamese to run it as a Vietnamese thing. And Washington said they would stay out of it, and they stayed out of it.
Of course, after that, Lucien Konin came to ask me the plan, to ask me the day and time. And I refused to say anything about it because I told to Konin, I am not authorized to say anything about it. But I said to Konin, we don't know if we will make a coup or not. And then Konin told me that his ambassador needs to know what day we will make a coup because he was called by President Kennedy for a report in Washington, in the White House, and he has to leave very soon.
2 days before the ambassador is due to leave for Washington, the generals ask him not to go. They fear his visit would signal the timing of the coup. Agent Konin now offers his own military advice to the generals.
With no instructions and no instructions from my government, I said, once that you're into the attack, you must continue. If you hesitate, you're going to be lost.
There are 3 days left for Diem. At almost the last moment, American resolve threatens to break. General Harkins, the U.S. military commander in Vietnam, only now learns of the approaching coup. He informs Ambassador Lodge of his deep opposition. This split between the two senior American officials causes concern and hesitation in Kennedy's inner circle. They ask Lodge if the coup can be called off. Lodge replies that he is now powerless to stop the coup. The matter is entirely in Vietnamese hands.
I wasn't brought into the picture in a complete way until literally the night before.
10 a.m. November 1st. Lodge routinely meets Diem at the presidential palace. 2 hours later, Diem is on the phone to Lodge.
Diem said, I hear these rumors now. And I know there's going to be a coup. But I don't know who's going to do it or where he's going to do it at. And he said the coup planners are much cleverer this time than they've ever been before, because there are a number of them, and I cannot find out which is the real one. That was noon.
At the same time, the coup planners summon senior officers and ask for their support. Only one officer refuses. He is later executed. CIA agent Konin is now with the generals at their headquarters as the coup begins.
I had a radio, a special radio that kept me into a special net directly to the embassy, plus I had with the junta, or the plotters agreement, that I had a special telephone line directly to the U.S. Embassy.
Then came the real thing. And we were sitting there having lunch when there was this tremendous automatic fire. It sounded as though it was right in the next room. And the planes flew overhead, and that was the beginning of the overthrow.
Coup forces seize key installations in Saigon, then deploy for the attack on the palace. A major surprise is the timing, the midday rest.
The time was 1:30 in the afternoon. Many people asked, even in that time, some friends asked me, why you make it in daytime and not in nighttime? I say, yes, all coups everywhere in the world were made in nighttime. And we were proud to do it because we believed that that coup was a good coup and we must do it in daytime. And we did it in daytime. And it surprised many people, especially the presidency and the presidential guards, because we knew that in nighttime you have to watch, you have to be awake, and you have to sleep in daytime.
At 4 p.m., before the palace is attacked, Diem is told to surrender. He refuses. His palace guard resists as fighting begins. Diem and his brother Nu learn the extent of the coup, but they refuse a second call to surrender. The coup leaders broadcast for public support, stating the old regime is finished. Diem now appeals to the Americans.
The telephone rang, and it was President Diem saying that the coup had begun, and he wanted to know what I was going to do. And I said that the obvious truth, that I had no instructions, that it was 4 o'clock in the morning in Washington, and I'd had no opportunity to do it. Oh, well, he said, you must know what the policy is. Well, I said, I don't know what the policy is for every circumstance. And I said, I'm worried about your safety. And I said, I've made arrangements to get you out of the country so as to protect your safety. And I said, if you don't like to do that, I said, I've made arrangements which would authorize your becoming titular chief of state. And you can stay here in a position of honor, and you'll be relatively safe. Well, he said, I don't want to do that. He said, I want to restore order, and I'm going back now to restore order, and he hung up.
The generals seek a quick end to the coup. They make repeated calls on Diem to surrender.
And during the coup, when Ngo Dinh Diem called me from his palace, I said to him, Mr. President, I am sorry for what happened, but you must understand the situation. What I ask you now, be wise and understand the situation. And a special plan is ready if you surrender without any conditions to carry you and your family out of Vietnam.
I asked the embassy for an aircraft, and I was told I had to wait 24 hours before I could get the aircraft that was necessary to transport Diem to a nation who would accept his exile.
Diem and his brother won't give up. They try to rally support, as they had successfully done in a coup attempt 3 years earlier. This time, they fail and secretly flee the palace in the early evening. They go to a previously arranged hideaway, the home of a Chinese friend in the suburb of Cholon.
President Diem came to my home at 2100 hours on November the 1st. When I saw the president arrive, I came out to meet him and invited him into my house. I did not talk to him. I only invited him into my house to rest and offered him tea. That's all.
By early next morning, Diem realizes his presidency is lost. He offers his surrender to the coup leaders, but hides his exact location. Diem instructs his loyal soldiers at the palace to cease fighting. Then he seeks refuge in a Catholic church. At 6:50 a.m., Diem and his brother phone the generals and surrender to a military guard sent to arrest them. The two brothers are executed by their captors.
I had reports of him, culminating, of course, in the horrible, tragic report of his assassination. Terrible thing, terrible thing.
The president, Kennedy, was informed of this coup going on at the very earliest stages. We had a series of meetings. And then, to everyone's shock and the president's particular shock, the news came in that President Diem and his brother New had been murdered.
Kennedy's military advisor, General Maxwell Taylor.
Well, when the cable came in, as I recall, it was brought in to him from the outside by one of his aides and put in front of him, and he read it. And there was a deep silence around the table, and the president was obviously shaken by this, sprang to his feet and walked out of the room saying nothing to anybody, and stayed out of the room for some minutes, then eventually came back and took his chair, collected, and then discussing, as we all did, the consequences, the causes, and what do we do about it.
And I think he felt a sense of personal responsibility for it. Certainly he hadn't anticipated it. Whether he should have or not is another problem, but he was very upset by it.
He didn't realize we were all playing with fire when we were at least giving tacit encouragement to the overthrow of this man.
Ambassador Lodge reports great joy in Saigon over the change of regime, but regret over Diem's death. With the new era in Saigon, Washington quickly announces its willingness to continue all American aid programs to Vietnam. 3 days later, the United States recognizes the new government. Just 3 weeks later, John F. Kennedy is himself assassinated. And in the United States and South Vietnam, new leaders embark on a new and enlarged phase of the war. Historians can only debate whether Kennedy would have avoided the direct military involvement of his successor, Lyndon Johnson. His special assistant, Arthur Schlesinger.
Kennedy, in the first place, had been very dubious about the whole question of a coup, and had been very disturbed by the green light cable that had gone off in Land of August. The whole idea of the coup was distasteful, but lodged cable that the events were beyond our control at the end of October. And then the death of Diem upset him, I think partly because he was a humane man, didn't like people being killed, particularly perhaps other heads of state, but in part because he may have feared that this was going to pull us in some other way, because this coup having taken place, we having a relationship to it, increased our responsibility.
An advisor in both the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, Assistant Secretary of Defense, William Bundy.
Certainly, President Johnson thought he was carrying on exactly the basic policy that President Kennedy had pursued. That is not to say for a moment that President Kennedy, had he lived, would have necessarily taken the same kinds of decisions that President Johnson did. I think he was always conscious that the structure there, the political structure, was an inherently very weak one. He was more skeptical, I think, than President Johnson of what American military force might do. Nobody wanted to see American military force, but I think he would have been more skeptical that it could be effective. So I don't want to say that that President Kennedy would necessarily have done the same sort of thing that President Johnson did, or hung on as rigidly as President Johnson and later President Nixon did.
This is a different kind of war. There are no marching armies or solemn declarations. But this is really war. It is guided by North Vietnam, and it is spurred by Communist China. Its goal is to conquer the South and to extend the Asiatic dominion of communism. And there are great stakes in the balance.
Johnson's key decisions begin in 1961. As vice president, he is sent to Vietnam to evaluate the situation and to bolster the South Vietnamese government. He arrives in Saigon with a personal letter from President Kennedy promising more American aid. 7 years earlier, as a senator, Johnson had strongly opposed using American air power to help save the French from defeat in Vietnam. Now he believes South Vietnam is vital to American interests. After meeting with high officials, Johnson tells Kennedy, the battle against communism in Southeast Asia must be joined with strength and determination. After Kennedy's death, Johnson must plan the U.S. role in Vietnam. A Kennedy foreign policy aide believes Johnson goes further than the late president intended. Roger Hilsman.
Kennedy is on the public record several times as saying, this is almost an exact quote, "It is their war, the South Vietnamese. We may give them aid and advisors, but they must win it or lose it." Johnson didn't agree with the last three words. And he did not change the policy, but what he did do was he removed the people who were obstacles to it.
Historians differ on whether Johnson led the U.S. into war or was misled by Kennedy advisors. Arthur Schlesinger, Jr.
Johnson may well have thought that he was doing what Kennedy would have done, and he may well have had reason to think this because he kept as advisors people like Secretary McNamara and McGeorge Bundy and others who in that period, though they came to change their minds later, still thought the war might be won.
Our response will depend upon the action of the aggressors, in this case, the North Vietnamese. The key to the situation remains the cessation of infiltration from the north into the south.
Defense Secretary McNamara visits the battlefield in March 1964. His field advisors tell him that the war is being won. But the fighting is increasing. McNamara assesses communist resolve and recommends more American aid. The U.S. now supplies South Vietnamese troops with the most modern equipment. They are given mobility and American helicopter pilots to fly them into battle. In this period, American advisors increased from 16,000 to 23,000. The American advisor is a non-combatant, but Americans in field operations are increasingly killed and wounded. McNamara is urged by senior advisors to increase the war effort. He says South Vietnam should order national mobilization, and the U.S. should equip this army. Now Johnson sends another military man as senior policy director. Chief of Staff General Maxwell Taylor becomes ambassador to Saigon. Taylor soon finds politics taking precedence.
Very soon I got there and started dealing with the first government, and that was the government of General Kahn. In the course of my ambassadorship, which had been agreed to last just 1 year, I dealt with 5 governments, which meant 5 sets of senior generals, 5 sets of provincial chiefs, 44 provinces. In other words, the house was cleaned and turned over 5 different times with a chaos that one can imagine. And it was perfectly apparent that we were going downhill on a losing course. If we didn't change that course, we'd better change our objective, or we'd better find additional assets to use.
Assets already in use include old fighter bombers piloted by mercenaries. They are used in neutral Laos in covert airstrikes against communist infiltration routes. But in 1964, Johnson permits U.S. Air Force jets to provide support flights. At the time, little is known about this jungle bombing, but it is the genesis of history's greatest air bombardment. Johnson's toughest days of decision begin in March 1964. He meets with McNamara. McNamara reports dangerous neutralist sentiment in Saigon. He recommends new, significant pressures on North Vietnam. On March 17th, the National Security Council recommends a 2-phase bombing program against the North. Either retaliatory strikes at 72 hours' notice or sustained bombing at 30 days' notice. Johnson approves the planning stage. But the views of Congress and the Allies have to be considered, and there are the coming presidential elections. Canada's Prime Minister Pearson agrees to send a tough warning to Hanoi. In June 1964, Canadian envoy Blair Seaborn pays a secret visit to Prime Minister Pham Van Dong in Hanoi.
Pham Van Dong gave a great sense of self-assurance, of confidence in the ability of himself and his fellow leaders and his country to withstand whatever rigors might come. He seemed tough, resilient. He didn't give any indications of looking for compromises. He didn't seem to think that any compromises were necessary, that his country and his leadership could hang in there longer than the South Vietnamese government could, and probably longer than the Americans could.
North Vietnam has been under attack for 5 months. There are secret naval engagements. They lead 6 weeks later to the Gulf of Tonkin confrontation, which becomes the fuse for all-out war. Former State Department official Daniel Ellsberg.
We were launching U.S.-run CIA missions of torpedo boats and other vessels against the shores of North Vietnam, shelling, kidnapping, even assassinating various places. And that this was part of a large-scale operation, and indeed the destroyers who were on an intelligence patrol were interwoven in their mission with those assaults on North Vietnam, as the North Vietnamese believed.
July 30th, the destroyer Maddox heads into the Gulf of Tonkin with orders to keep 8 miles offshore. July 31st, South Vietnamese commandos stage an assault on the North Vietnamese islands of Han My and Han Nu. August 2nd, the Maddox reports she is exchanging fire with 3 North Vietnamese torpedo boats. State Department official William Bundy.
There was a clear-cut attack on one American destroyer on August the 2nd. There's never been any doubt of that attack. Bullet holes, all the rest.
August 3rd, the destroyer C. Turner Joy links up with the Maddox. Both head back into the Gulf. August 4th, flash from Pacific Naval Command. Both destroyers now under attack. It is noon in Washington. The security chiefs convene and agree on reprisal targets. Johnson approves. A prearranged code is sent. It is 3 a.m. in the Pacific. The carrier planes load up to launch at 1200 hours. Just 1 hour later, Pacific Naval Command sends another urgent flash. It informs McNamara that the second attack on the destroyers isn't actually confirmed. He begins a grim vigil, but doesn't delay the hour of the airstrikes. His chief assistant, William Bundy, on the evidence leading to the first bombing of the North.
We had intercepted North Vietnamese messages that followed in sequence on the date of August 4th. Get ready to attack, advanced readiness, go ahead and attack, and then a report of what they had done. Well, this intelligence evidence, which in the case of the intercepts could not be disclosed at the time, seemed to all of us in the government to make it conclusive that North Vietnam had made a second attack.
Johnson waits. There are 30 minutes left in the countdown. The first bombing of North Vietnam begins at 11 a.m., August 5th, 1964. The planes are in the air as Johnson announces his decision.
Renewed hostile actions against United States ships on the high seas in the Gulf of Tonkin have today required me to order the military forces of the United States to take action in reply.
Johnson has planned staggered strikes to gauge communist response. Targets are close to the partition line. 10% of North Vietnam's oil storage facilities are destroyed. August 7th, Congress overwhelmingly approves the so-called Gulf of Tonkin resolution, called a blank check for presidential action. On congressional reaction, Chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, Senator William Fulbright.
He sold it as a means to prevent any widening of the war, as I believe the language he used to use, that we were going to face this little country, as he said, I think 17 million people. And with the great might of the United States, they would clearly be inclined to settle and to compromise and have a peaceful settlement, and that there wouldn't be any war. In other words, if we acted together and showed our united strength, this was the way to prevent a major war.
In Hanoi, 3 days after the bombing, Canada's go-between pays a second secret call on Pham Van Dong.
But at that time, I was asked to come back with, I suppose in many ways, a repeat of the previous message, but this time with a slightly stronger tone to it, saying, look, on behalf of the Americans, we find it pretty hard to take this sort of thing, attacks on our warships. And if it continues, there may indeed be escalation. Now, he became visibly angry. For a moment or two, I thought he was just going to get up and say, that's the end of the interview, Seaborn, on your way. But I interposed rather quickly, and I said, Mr. Prime Minister, can I use the old phrase about not shooting the messenger?
The occasional airstrikes and the warning of more ahead failed to intimidate Pham Van Dong.
I don't think there was any flexibility on the North Vietnamese side. They saw no reason to be flexible. They're quite confident if they hung tough and hung in there long enough, they would eventually have things the way they wanted them. And I suppose, in large measure, history has proven them to be right.
1964. Johnson runs for president as a peace candidate. Opponent Barry Goldwater talks of tactical nuclear weapons.
Make no mistake, there is no such thing as a conventional nuclear weapon.
He says, I've had advice to bomb certain areas that I think would enlarge the war. And he adds, we are not about to send American boys to fight an Asian war. In November, Johnson wins a landslide victory. In South Vietnam, the war escalates. The U.S. Bien Hoa Air Base near Saigon after a guerrilla mortar barrage. The military command demands swift reprisals for what it calls a communist change of the ground rules. The Americans find no safe ground in the coming months. Explosions shatter Saigon public buildings. Cafes, bars, restaurants, U.S. military headquarters, even the embassy, are hit by terrorists. Johnson's advisors want retaliation. He restrains them, demanding proof the South Vietnamese can't fight their own war. Advisor John Kenneth Galbraith.
He made a persuasive case that what he was trying to do was restrain the military and restrain the cold warriors in the State Department. I remember his saying once, Ken, do you have any idea what Curtis LeMay would be doing if I weren't here to restrain him? President Johnson was trying to follow a moderate or a mediatory policy, or would like to have done so if the weight of the military and the dynamics of military involvement weren't pressing him in the other direction.
The American government prepares for tougher action. Evacuation of U.S. dependents has been planned as a first step before escalation of bombing. Now it goes into effect. February 1965. The U.S. advisors' compound at Pleiku, then at Quy Nhon, are severely hit. 9 Americans killed, 76 wounded. New communist infiltrators are said to number 34,000, triple the previous estimate. These developments make up Johnson's mind. Although Johnson's top field men, Ambassador Taylor and General Westmoreland, disagree over strategy, the president decides on a period of sustained bombing. Dawn, March the 2nd, 1965. 100 fighter bombers cross the 17th parallel into North Vietnam. Operation Rolling Thunder begins. Within minutes, targets are hit. Bridges, rail lines, supply and port areas are cut in a bombing plan a year in the making. The plan is to hit hard, then pause, to force some conciliatory signal from below. This first day, the jets delivered 200 tons of ordnance. In 8 years of air war in North and South Vietnam, the U.S. will drop close to 8 million tons of bombs, quadruple the tonnage used throughout World War II. Throughout the war, the Americans believe that bombing can bring peace.
We are making progress. We are pleased with the results that we're getting. We are inflicting greater losses than we're taking.
But the military reports that North Vietnam's resolve is stiffening. The U.S. commander, General Westmoreland, now argues for combat troops while criticizing the on-off bombing approach.
Frankly, it just didn't work. They could have received quite a different message. If we had prepared ourselves to deliver a big blow, that would have hurt them severely. One of the impacts in the North of this graduated response was when they realized what was taking place, they immediately dissipated the targets. And instead of having their petroleum concentrated in one place, they moved it around in little penny packages around the country.
Now Johnson faces an even tougher decision. In Vietnam, Ambassador Taylor favors the bombing, but opposes landing troops. Defense Secretary McNamara is beginning to doubt that the war is worth the cost. But the president is persuaded by Secretary of State Rusk that Westmoreland is right. American troops are needed.
Beginning November and December of '64 and continuing on through the early months of '65, the North Vietnamese began to move the divisions and regiments of their regular forces into South Vietnam. They were threatening to cut the place in two through the highlands. And the shape of the struggle became very different. Now, that posed some problems that President Kennedy had never had to consider. And President Johnson had to look at a new situation. And so we had to consider whether we got out under those circumstances or tried to resist that increased force being applied by the North Vietnamese. And the decision was made to try to resist it.
On March 8, 1965, the first U.S. Marines, 3,500 of them, land at Da Nang. Mission: to defend the Da Nang Air Base. The American public is assured the Marines will not engage in combat. But within the month, the Pentagon considers requests from General Westmoreland for 90,000 combat troops. On April 1st, Johnson decides that American ground troops can be used in combat, but he orders that this decision be kept secret. U.S. forces in Vietnam now total 27,000. Within weeks, this force will double, and within 2 years will reach nearly 500,000 men. Ambassador Taylor.
I concurred with the landing of the Marines. Once we brought any troops in, that was the nose of the camel, and it'd be very difficult to know how much was enough. My business as an ambassador was primarily to find out what is our intention now, where do we go from here? And I found that the president and I heard no advisor who did not share his feelings that we really had to lift the level of our support to include ground forces until the field commander could say he had a stable situation.
Johnson backs his field commanders, sending more and more troops. Within 3 years, the U.S. force exceeds 500,000, and still it is not enough. But year by year, North Vietnamese infiltration frustrates the American strategy. As Johnson loses public support, he decides he cannot win the war, and instead ends his presidency. Johnson biographer Doris Kearns.
Simply put, at the bottom of everything, Johnson needed to be liked by people. You could see it in his face when he walked in a room. Despite that overbearing dominance, there was that sense of, please like me, I'm going to give you a gift. And he did. He gave gifts of the Great Society, the civil rights laws. Even in Vietnam, he thought he could couple with all the bombing and the damage to the fabric of that country. He really assumed that somehow he'd bring this massive foreign aid program over there and he'd rebuild Vietnam.
Johnson's days of decision are over. As Buddhist demonstrations spread, other factions support them, and the government responds with greater force. In August, special police raid Buddhist pagodas and arrest senior monks. Washington publicly condemns the pagoda raids, but is divided on policy. Former CIA Director William Colby.
That period of 1963 was one of the most agonizing and intense periods of debate that I've ever experienced inside our government. There was a very intense division of opinion in the government.
The division is over South Vietnam's president, Ngo Dinh Diem, whether he's a viable ally after 8 years of autocratic family rule. Washington decides Diem may regain popularity if his brother and chief advisor, Nhu, is removed. Washington cables Ambassador Lodge. He is told to inform key Vietnamese generals of American concern. But the cable is interpreted as a green light for a coup d'etat. An author of the cable, Assistant Secretary of State Roger Hilsman.
The overall gist of that cable was...
That horrified President Kennedy. I remember going into the Oval Room, and there was the picture of this old man sitting cross-legged, burning himself alive. And President Kennedy said, look at that. Look at what things have come to.
The U.S. calms the crisis, But Buddhist leaders complain of continued persecution and take their cause to the streets. In summer-long riots, a dozen Buddhists are killed, hundreds injured. In late June, President Kennedy formally appoints Henry Cabot Lodge as ambassador to Saigon and tells him,
I have confidence in you, and I want you to go out there and see if we can't get the government to behave better.
Does that mean you'll be arriving on the scene with sympathy for the Buddhist cause?
It means I'll be arriving on the scene as an American who believes in religious tolerance.
Before Lodge arrives, 5 monks commit suicide.
Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
The attempt to assure liberty in South Vietnam leads to war. The turning point is the assassination of an ally.
I regret the necessities of war have compelled us to bomb North Vietnam. We have carefully limited those raids. They've been directed at concrete and steel, and not human life.
President Johnson inherits the Vietnam burden and commits America to combat. These early days are the most critical days of decision.
To say that we would prefer a government continuing with ZM, but if they felt, the generals, that they had no choice, then we would examine the government that they established on its own merits. Now, of course, there is no question that this, with all of its hedges, does encourage them.
We frightened an awful lot of generals by asking them because they were terrified that this would get back to the government and lead to their arrest and incarceration, if at least. They said no at that time, but they said, if we get interested, we'll give you a call sometime.
The generals are not yet ready to act, but the climate for a coup develops in late August. 5 days after his arrival, Ambassador Lodge sends Washington an optimistic appraisal of a revolt by the generals. The political pressure mounts in early September. 800 high school students are arrested for joining Buddhist protests. Kennedy is concerned over Diem's actions, but the possible loss of South Vietnam alarms him.
We don't want to have a repetition of China, because that was the most damaging event, certainly, that's occurred to us. And
Here now is the chief executive.
there's a long history of our effort to prevent Vietnam from falling under the control of the communists. That is what we are now attempting to do, and as the war has increased in scope, our assistance has increased as a result of the requests of the government.
June 1963, President John F. Kennedy's support of the Saigon government is shaken by internal opposition led by the Buddhists. In Saigon, an elderly monk burns himself to death in protest against religious discrimination. The highly publicized suicide further dismays President Kennedy, who is about to appoint a new ambassador, Henry Cabot Lodge.